could happen without the service of our great volunteer flag officers. Remember, when you become a flag officer at the St. Francis Yacht Club, you sign up for a no-pay, all-work adventure. And so I want to introduce, we have all three flag officers here today. So our Rear Commodore, Chris Perkins. Welcome, buddy. Chris Perkins. And our Vice Commodore, Bo Vrolek. Bo, welcome, buddy. And please, a real warm grill room welcome for our Commodore, Petey Gilmore. Come on up, Pete.
Thank you for that great introduction, Ron. And thank you for all the production you do and your team to bring these Wednesday yachting lunches to us. It's great to be back in the grill room. I also want to thank our staff who put all the spread together here. And then anybody that has anything to do with Stevens Yachts that are here today, and especially Rusty. Where's Rusty?
Right here.
Oh, thank you, Rusty, for your involvement in putting this together. So how great is this? You know, I saw the old Stevens Seabreeze down there. That boat has been around the club for quite a long time. As a matter of fact, I was probably 7 years old up at Tinsley Island, sitting on the back of it, eating SpaghettiOs one day. But no, these boats are amazing, and you know, I know that Stevens made a handful of non-wood boats. But I do remember the framed quote that said, if God meant there to be fiberglass boats, he would have made fiberglass trees. But anyway, I want to thank all of those who you know take on the job of keeping these boats alive. The passion that you have and the pride of ownership is off the chart, and we thank you because they're wonderful to look at. And thank you for keeping them alive. I'll turn it back to Ron now. Thank you.
We just got through hearing that we have Stevens owners in the room, and so we want to start out by, before introducing Stevens owners, we want to introduce the members of the Stevens family. Jane Stevens, would you please introduce those members of the Stevens family here? Stand up and introduce your flock.
This is my cousin Pat Stevens. She's the daughter of Dick Stevens. I'm the daughter of Barry Stevens. And then we have Theo, who's the son of Theo Stevens. We had two twin sisters, and their families couldn't make it today. The brother and my twin sisters.
And you have Nancy Drew Stevens. Nancy Drew Stevens.
Is that mom?
Yes, exactly. Always rallying for the Stevens causes. Introduce more folks at the table. Let's hear who you are. It's a whole legacy, famous legacy.
We're boat owners. Yeah, they're boat owners.
Okay.
A good friend, Deanna Hansen, who sailed with my dad, who got into sailing with him, and then I ended up sailing with Deanna as well. And then Dan is Pat's husband.
Wonderful.
You'd have to, I don't know.
Okay, next up is Stevens boat owners. Anybody who owns a Stevens or brought one here, stand up, and I want the owner to tell us who he's brought with him today. Tell the name of your boat, your name, the name of your boat, and who helped you bring it here. Right over here, start off, begin with.
Okay, I'm Noel Lindsay. I have a 1941 36-foot Stevens motor yacht. And Chris McFadden is my guest here today. He has the exact opposite type of boat.
Exact opposite, no. Good on you, buddy.
Bruce Jones with Ted Collins and Rusty. We have Folly 2, which lives right here.
What year was Folly 2 built?
Perkins, 1931.
1931.
Wow. So
good on you, mate. Next.
Dave Hoyt, 1961, 47-foot in Emeryville. Just here by myself today.
And what's the name of the boat?
White Swan.
Oh my goodness, wonderful. White Swan, terrific. Sir.
My name's Scott Andrews. I own a 1929 34-foot Stevens called Makoto. Many of you may have seen it on the cover of Wooden Boat magazine.
Beautiful. We accept boasting about owning Stevens. Yes, sir.
I'm Tom Wiseman, this is my wife Janice. We're from Walnut Grove, the neighbors of Rusty, and we have a 1958 45-foot Stevens on Rusty's lot.
What's she called?
Donella.
Wonderful, wonderful. Yes, sir.
I get the microphone.
Good. Thank you, John, for bringing the mic. This is John Bechtel, who helps on the Wednesday Yachting Lunch Committee. Thank you, John. Thank you, buddy.
So I have a 1931 43-foot triple cruising Stevens. Was commissioned by Judge Elliott here in San Francisco, and it was called Mobby 2. So I plan on restoring that name and putting it back. It's in restoration right now, in water though.
In our front yard.
That sounds like a wife's voice.
And Dale Wells and Rusty were there when, before I put the cover over it. So I am a commercial contractor and I built it on, and I can drive it about 2 feet.
And he's gonna call it Denise, he just doesn't know it yet.
Yes, sir.
So Joe Garisco, I have a 1952 Stevens sedan cruiser, 43 feet. It was started at 52, but Mr. Ziegler says his wife kept changing her mind, so it wasn't completed until 1955.
What's the boat called?
Serenus.
Wonderful.
It's in Tiburon.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
I'm Mark Harrington. I own M104, which was commissioned in late 1962 by the St. Francis Yacht Club member Albert Roller, the architect. And I've been 3.5 years restoring it almost every single day, but she's really in fine shape. And during her lifetime, she's been to Alaska and Mexico.
Wonderful. David's right by you. David.
Hello, I'm David Cobb. I own a 1939 Stevens, and it's Seabreeze, which was mentioned earlier. I'm a member of this club when it was launched in 1939. It's kept the same name ever since, and it's just about as beautiful.
Wonderful, David. Thank you.
Jim Gabbard, sometimes on television you speak James, and I guess I'm the youngin' here because we have Defiance, which was launched in '72, and she's only 51 years old. She's 85 feet, and she's out here, and I've owned her for 45 years. And I tell you, the amount of time I spent up at Stevens, not with that boat, but all the different boats that Stevens made, I became pretty good friends with Dick and Theo, and I could just say they build great boats.
I'm Bill Parker, and this is my brother John Parker, and this is Carl Packard. Carl and I discovered the Merganser, which was at that time called Wintun, in Napa about 20 years ago. And so we redid it, and it's out by the first dock of the road where you walk down. I found out just today that one of the Stevens daughters was delivered by the original owner of that boat. It was a Dr. Chapman, and it was called Betty Lou. And when I mentioned that name to her, she said, "Oh my God, I think she delivered me." So anyway, we're here in beautiful function. Thank you.
Wonderful. Bill Belmont has one, Johnny. Bill Belmont, right behind you. Bill Belmont by the bar. Bill?
Hi there. We own Farallon Clipper number 8 Credit, which one originally built was a spec boat and was painted red. And later on, my wife is Debbie's sister. They were both built at the same time.
Debit and credit.
Debit and credit. Lots of pictures of debit and credit. And there's 5 of us still actively racing. And Petita 2, number 1, is in Sausalito, and they just cruise it out.
So, as everyone knows, when you own a wooden boat, you never mention the word finances. So we're going to let Bill have a little excuse there. He was naming the boats. Next.
All right, I'm Rand Siegfried. We've got Sea Dog with my wife and I. Came over here with Bill, Chuck, Tracy, and Cormac. And she was launched in 32. She's 55 feet. She has always been named Sea Dog. She was the original showboat by a guy named Sneeve. And she has been from the next, in her first year, has spent showing off his wares from Mexico up into Alaska and back every year. So she's got a little bit of history, and we've been enjoying her. Bill Wells, I've got a 1936 or 1937 36-foot Stevens sedan. Mel Owen tells a story that he knew the original owner, and I guess he bought the boat, and his wife didn't like it, so she wanted him to sell it. So this is like about 1937. So they sold the boat and bought a vineyard in Napa. And so I always wonder myself, you know, here I got a boat worth a few $1,000s, and I wonder what the vineyard's worth today. Hi, I'm Jim Sweeney. A 22-year owner of the 43-foot 1929 Stevens cruiser Elizabeth. When we bought it, it was named Bounty, and the dinghy was named Mutiny. Anyway, Elizabeth has had a deal-up restoration, and everything that San Francisco Bay and Carquinez Straits can throw at it, she has withstood beautifully, and I couldn't be happier with this acquisition. Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Patrick Welch, and I think I have Jim Gabbard beat. I think mine's the newest one. 1972, so it just turned 50.
Mike, keep the mic close. Mike.
The boat is a 48-foot Stevens named Triple Crown, and I keep it at Jack London's store now. And at one time, it was owned by the people that own the Racehorse Secretariat, hence the name Triple Crown.
So after the luncheon, all here are welcome to come down to the docks and see, and in the water, you know, Dockside Stevens boat show. It's the biggest one actually ever we've had, and that's a wonderful thing. One of the boats down there, the beautiful blue aluminum 1966 sloop Alpha. That owner, Nick Raggio, isn't here today. He delivered the boat, which was wonderful. He had other things he had to do. I happened to be at the christening for that boat in 1966 in Sausalito as Theo Stevens' guest as a young guy, and I then sailed on that boat in 66, 67, 68, and so on. It raced in a class called AB in those days, between A class and B class, or A division and B division on the bay. And in 68, Theo and Hank Easton and the yacht club picked me to be part of the California Cup crew. So Theo Stevens and I sailed with each other on other boats besides just Stevens, but he didn't like any boats as well as the ones that he designed and or built. We were in a beautiful Columbia 50 at LA Yacht Club in 68, and as fast as that boat was, he would always say, well, you know, if it was a Stevens. And so that gets us to our speaker today. He was born in the Central Valley, and his family had produced milk. And at age 6, he decided to leave the water and get out on an aluminum dinghy, which he'll show you a little bit later on. He became an avid water skier, and avid means you're willing to water ski in the sloughs of San Francisco Delta, which is a wonderful kind of a thing. He went on to great things, as we all know. Graduated from Chico State, doing graduate work at Harvard, and becoming the chairman of the California Coastal Commission in 1996, becoming the director of the California State Parks in 1999, and founding California Strategies, a very savvy political strategy group in the state of California. And he is responsible for not only just one Stevens, but he's actually got an interest in 3. And you know, everybody knows the definition of a boat. It is a hole in the water into Witchaport money unless, and I know this story because I own an 85-year-old 1937 IOD, it's a hold the water into Witchaport money unless it's a wooden boat where there's active suction. And so nobody can talk more about that than the owner of Miss 102 and Joie de Vie. Come on up. Rusty, come on up, buddy. Rusty Arias, our speaker today. Welcome, Rusty.
Thank you. Thanks, buddy. Thank you very much, Ron. You know, at these gatherings and in talking to and listening to Stevens owners and stories about their boats, I always learn new things and get new material. As an example, I didn't know that the doctor who owned the boat delivered one of the Stevens kids. I didn't know that our Commodore Pete Gilmore was conceived on Seabreeze. Thanks, Pete. That's how rumors get started. Anyway, I want to first thank the members of St. Francis Yacht Club for honoring me and all the Stevens aficionados, Stevens family, with this presentation and this lunch. I want to thank Ron Young, who has coordinated this for many years. I want to thank the Stevens owners, who many of them took time out of their busy schedules on short notice to bring their boats here for your pleasure. And I hope you'll all take time, and you're wearing rubber-soled shoes, or take your shoes off when you go on to those remarkable crafts. And then also the CYA, Classic Yacht Association, and all participating guests. Thank you. Thank you very much. You truly honor not only the Stevens family, and it's fabulous that Theo and Bear and Dick's descendants are here amongst us, all represented. But you honor the hands. I didn't get the memo. Yeah, sorry. You honor the hands of the workers, the artisans who produced these fabulous crafts. Any of us that have spent time at the Hagen Museum, we go there and someone with white gloves, a curator, pulls the file when you give them the whole number, and you sit there and you go through the history of your boat. All of us that are Stevens owners have experienced that. Some of you that are friends have accompanied Stevens owners. And it's like an archaeological deep dive. It's like 23andMe all wrapped into one. You know, you'll learn things about your vessel that you didn't know, whether it's disputes over money, or disputes over design, or disputes over timing. It's all there, handwritten or on a typewriter. But it's part of the romance of going to the Hagen Museum. And any of you that haven't been there, go, because it's more than just about Stevens. They have all the archives of Caterpillar there. They have fabulous representations of Albert Bierstadt and Thomas Hill. It's a great little museum that you never hear much about in the Bay Area. And with all due respects to your profession, Carl, it would have to burn down to be mentioned in the San Francisco papers. But it's a great experience, and I'd encourage you to go there. This, the picture in front of you, this is my boat, Miss 102. And I apologize in advance if there are too many pictures of my boats. I never get tired of looking at them, and I hope you won't either. But Dick Stevens and his family gave us this model, which is in the Hagen Museum of Miss 102, and I'll get into her history a little later. And she's on the docks out here, so I hope you'll come around and tour. To really understand the Stevens history and the Stevens family and everything that was going on in Central California at that time, you've got to really go back to Stockton in about 1850, right around the gold rush. And at that time, a sloop called the Mary Mason was the first boat to slide down the banks of the Delta and into the waters. And that began the commerce. And it began Stockton. It was the start of Stockton becoming a great building center to build these fabulous vessels in the Delta region. Because commerce was becoming important, and there weren't bridges, and there weren't telephones, and there weren't roads. And so they depended on their waterways for transportation. And a man named Stephen Davis got a contract to build Siberian steamers. And he was really kind of the founder of the Stockton boat building industry. After Mr. Davis died in 1886, numerous companies had sprung up at that particular time, and they built dredges, and they built tugs, and they built freighters, and they built paddle wheels, and they even built houseboats at that particular time. And this picture is in the Stockton estuary, and two of the Stevens brothers' first boat, Gee Whiz on the right and Queen on the left, are represented there. In about 1900, the Stevens sons, who had moved to Yosemite Street in Stockton, they were 18 and 20 years old, respectively, Theo and Roy Stevens. And there have been numerous attempts to build boats. And their uncle, Cy Moring, had been in the transportation business, in the boating business, and their family were farmers in the Linden area. But they were living in Stockton on the waterfront. And their first successful attempt at building a boat was Dorothy, the 33-foot sloop you see on the left side, my left side, of this picture. And it was a handsome craft, and they took it out as young men out the Golden Gate and all the way down to Santa Cruz. Word quickly got around about these young boat builders and their talents, and they got their first commercial contract, $1,000 down, and they built Gee Whiz for a local businessman. And there's Gee Whiz on the right-hand side as they're sliding it down. They were building all these boats in their backyard on Yosemite Street. And the neighbors were getting concerned. They were out there working late at night, and it was kind of a mess, as a boatyard can be. And about that time, one of the local duck clubs hired both Theo and Roy to build them a 50-foot motor launch. And that was their third boat. So they built a sailboat and two power boats in their first three efforts. Charles? This is Beaver, a river tug that they built just about that same time. Their fame and reputation grew very rapidly. Move along. This is the Kohlberg Transportation Company. All Stevens boats, all boats that were contracted by Stevens in downtown Stockton. It kind of looks a little like Venice. This was a Curtiss seaplane. And this gives you an idea of the talents of the people that they had put together at Stevens Brothers. Mr. Curtiss was having trouble with his seaplane, so he brought it to the Stevens Brothers to help him iron out the problems. One of the big advantages that Stevens Brothers had was right next to them was an ironworks, the Samson Gasoline Engine Company. And Samson employed numerous engineers, and this really changed the way boats were powered throughout the Delta. Because up until that time, they were all steamers and wind-powered. And to be able to adapt to gasoline engines really allowed the company to grow rapidly. And with Samson right next door to them at the Stevens Yard, they were able to tap into the engineering expertise. This is the George Shima. As you know, Stockton and the Delta was a big agricultural area. George Shima was the potato king. And the helm of the George Shima, the pilot house, was the was the office for the Maritime Academy, and Darlene Plumtree and Carl Nolte are here, and that was Darlene's office for a long, long, long time. The neighbors began getting very restless and upset, and so the Stevenses, they bought a barge and they put it out on the Delta, and that became their first shipyard. And then a few years later, in 1920, when they outgrew the barge, they built the shipyard that is now Five-Star Marine in Stockton on the Stockton waterfront, and this was the beginnings of it. Stevens always had a unique ability to adapt. That was one of their great secrets to success. And as I go through this program, you will see that they reinvented themselves depending on market conditions many, many times. So envision the Delta, you know, the dewatering of the Delta, reclaiming all that agricultural land. And there were farmers out there that were growing all kinds of produce, and there were no bridges or telephones to communicate with them. So whoever had the fastest boat, and they called these merchant or spud boats, whoever had the fastest boat was advantaged when they would take their orders and go out and meet with the farmers. And to bring attention to just how fast their boat was, they set a record for the fastest trip in 1911 from Stockton to San Francisco on the Fred F. Lamborn. That got them a lot of publicity, and as a result of that, they were able to sell a lot of these spud boats. The Depression was actually very good for the Stevens brothers, and there was a number of reasons for that. Charles, move to the next one. They built a lot of boats like this one. They began building cruisers. They started building runabouts. This family is on their way to Lake Tahoe. This boat, which is very similar to the one in the Hagen Museum, they built a boat called Oski for the UC Berkeley rowing team. This is a boat called Conquest in 1929. So they started building very, very nice cruisers. And it's largely because the spud boat business had kind of come to an end because you had roads and bridges and telephones. And as a result of that, there was no longer a need for merchants on fast boats to race out to the farmers. So they reinvented themselves, and they started making cruisers. Via Mita is in Hawaii at the Honolulu Yacht Club. It got a lot of publicity years ago and went through numerous hands, but she's restored and she can be chartered on Honolulu Bay. This is Folly 2. You're going to see and hear a lot about Folly 2. This is a boat that I chased for 10 years, and I think Bruce mentioned earlier, Ted Collins and Bruce Jones and John Perkins and I all got together and bought Folly and restored her. This boat was ordered originally by Johnny Joseph Marino, a notorious rum runner. And in 1934, he was indicted with 11 San Luis Obispo County ranchers who were allowing him to pull up on their piers, and I'm sure for a price. They were offloading hooch, rum, and other alcohols for delivery into San Francisco, Santa Barbara, San Diego, and all points beyond. Go back one. You notice that they're flying the St. Francis. Go back to the sinister picture. They're flying the St. Francis Bergie. Now, Johnny Joseph Marino was not a member of St. Francis. In fact, he was indicted. But after Prohibition, he sold the boat to Beryl Buck of the Buck Center and Buck Family Trust in Marin County. And she owned it for 7 years. It was drafted into World War II. She's on the front of the boat. Keep going, Charles. That's the interior of her, and when you board her today to see her, you will see that interior is largely intact. That's her when we were bringing her in for restoration. We found her down in, well, I'd been watching her for about 10 years down in Monterey. A guy named Sam Garrett bought her, but she was coming in to begin restoration, and this is her on Dick Stevens' 100th birthday, Dick Stevens Day in Stockton, and that's Dick on the front. Sadly, he died a year later. And then that's May Willow. The reason that Stevens did well during the Depression was they began to develop the East Coast market. And May Willow was at the New York Boat Show. And they got a whole slug of orders as a result of that, where she stole the show as a commuter boat for a businessman.
St. Francis Burgee again.
There you go.
There you go.
Well, the Stevens family were a big part of St. Francis and competed in many of the races. Then they began building various sloops, and Jada was one, Pajaro was another. The Farallon Clipper came along not too long after that. I think they made a half dozen Farallon Clippers to start with. That boat was very popular, and there's a Farallon Clipper represented on the docks today. And there's Seabreeze. Seabreeze is with us today. This is a fabulous little boat. David Cobb, thank you very much for taking such good care of her. Seabreeze, Dave will tell you the story, but she was a part of World War II, like Folly. And when she went into the Navy, a general got a hold of her, and this particular general loved ice cream. So she has a compartment built into her just so he could store his ice cream under lock and key. 1941, Stevens goes to war. And this was the time period when Stevens built more boats than any other. Not pleasure craft as much as boats for the war effort. And the Stevens family and Stevens Company helped us win 4 wars: World War I, World War II, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War. They were involved in military contracting in all of them. This is one of the largest boats they ever built, a 136-foot minesweeper in 1941. And you know, they were contacted early on because people in Washington and in the military knew that war was inevitable. And so they were contacted and began making arrangements. This is a picket boat. These boats were used as launches. They were used as small tenders, and they were used as patrol boats, and they built a lot of them. This is a salvage boat. I think they built 50 of these salvage boats during World War II. This is a tug. And this boat, which looks like a sedan that a family would have, what they would do is when the military came in, they took all the boats that were under contract and just claimed them. And just said, you know, sorry, but this is your contribution to the war effort. And they painted them gray and gave them a number, and you know, they returned them in some cases after the war to their rightful owners. They had a big business on rescue boats, and these look like PT boats, but they built a lot of these, and they were really fast. They'd go 37 miles an hour. The smaller one in the prior picture had a sick bay for up to 6 injured soldiers, people, and they had a range of about 500 miles. And they probably made 100 of these rescue boats. That's Folly again, the boat that Jonathan and Ted and Bruce and I restored. Folly, of course, is down here on the docks. Admiral Nimitz's launch in World War II. She was called to and given 2 days to get to Sausalito. Beryl Buck owned her. They painted her gray and renamed her YP-144, Yard Patrol 144, and that's the name of our LLC, YP-144. After the war, Beryl Buck got her back, and sold her to her neighbor in Santa Rosa, Ken Bechtel, Warren Bechtel's son. So the Bechtel family owned her for 7 years, and it was no longer necessary for her to be varnished. You know, this is a double plank teak hull on this boat. Double plank teak hull. Most of them are mahogany on oak frames, double plank teak hull. And, you know, in the old days, when she first came out of Stevens Boatyard, she was all varnished. The whole hull was varnished. And the suspicion was it was because Johnny Joseph Marino wanted to go undetected at night and be able to outrun with his Holland Scott engines that burned 60 gallons an hour the authorities. It would do 22 knots. So when Ken Bechtel got her, the Bechtel family got her, they painted her white in the more traditional way. After the war, Theo Stevens had passed away in 1933. Roy Stevens had been running it, and it was time to turn it over to the next generation. And this is Theo and Bear and Dick Stevens when they were starting out, when they were taking over the reins of Stevens Brothers. This is a name that may be familiar with any of you that spent any time in Monterey Bay. This is a boat called Sea Stag that was built by Stevens Brothers. It could haul up to 36 people for tours around Monterey Bay, powered by Holland Scott engines again. And, you know, this boat lives on. It was in Sacramento for a long time, and now it's in upstate New York for sale if any of you are interested. She's 36 feet. 36 feet, and she's living in upstate New York. This is during the Korean War. Stevens Brothers, again, was involved in the war effort, and they came up with the innovation of being able to remove the motors of the boat from the bottom of the hull instead of having to cut it out from the top. And this saved all kinds of time. It was an important innovation that happened at Stevens Brothers. When the war was over, they had all kinds of material that they had bought for their contracting. And they began again to build pleasure craft. The boat at the top is called Amelia Marie. She was one of 3 boats that Ted Bricks from Stockton, who Dick Stevens described as a dilettante with great taste and a wallet to match. He had an organ installed on this boat. And unlike other boats, you know, Chris Crafts and others that tended to be more mass-produced, these boats were built for, you know, whatever the owner wanted. I owned a boat called Contessa. It was the first Stevens that I bought. You'll see her later. She had a picnic box on the front deck in between the 2 hatches. And I asked Dick Stevens one day, I said, I've never seen a picnic box like this again. He said, but that's because it's the only one we ever built. I said, well, why'd you build it? This is great. Why didn't you build more? He said, it was because the owner wanted it. Another owner never asked for one. So that was Amelia Marie. You're gonna hear a lot more about Amelia Marie and a boat called Joie that has caused me great pain. That was the last boat that Ted Bricks owned. They also built houseboats, and with all respect to the Stevens family, you know, it wasn't their greatest design. But I will tell you, they are so well built that they will outlive all of us. And you see them still around the Delta. They were the first aluminum boats that the Stevens built. And this is the first sailboat, aluminum sailboat that they built. This is Alpha, and I think there is a model of Alpha here in the hallway. In the hallway.
And the boat's on the dock outside. You can get up.
Right, and Alpha is on the dock. So if you don't want to see the model, you can go look at the real thing. That was back up a minute, Charles. That was the first sailboat, and this was at a time when fiberglass was taking over, and the wood boat owners, I think, just thinking back, were probably so sanctimonious about wood that Stevens was afraid they would lose all their customers if they went to fiberglass. I think, you know, one famous marine architect called fiberglass akin to frozen snot. He hated it so much. And so instead of going to fiberglass, they went to aluminum. And they didn't know a lot about aluminum, so they went to Sparkman and Stevens on the East Coast, and this was a joint venture that they put together, and it was their first aluminum sailing effort. This was a minesweeper that they were building, 144 feet. This is a Junior Clipper. This was a small version. They built a lot of them with materials left over from the war, and it was not a successful effort for Stevens. That's me. That's my first boat ride with my godfather and Uncle Jim. It was the 1955 or 56 flood in the Central Valley, and my uncle had been run out of his house by the rising waters, and we had to go in and lift the refrigerator up on sawhorses to keep it from getting damaged. And it's a new addition to this presentation. My godfather's wife gave it to me, and I thought I'd add it to the presentation. My first boat ride. That's me up front. Love at first sight. Sea Witch. This is the first Stevens boat I'd ever seen. My buddy Tom Wiseman, who I've been water skiing with for 22 years now. We ski 160 or 70 mornings a year. We were out on the Delta one day and we saw this boat coming at us. And I had looked at a Chris Craft earlier that was on the dock, and it kind of got me interested in Stevens boats. And I saw this boat and I couldn't believe the lines on it. And I started asking around a little bit, and that led me to the Hagen Museum. Keep going. While I was at the Hagen learning about Stevens, I saw this drawing. And this is a boat called Westlake. It flew the St. Francis Yacht Club. Birchie Henry Dolger was a member here. And you can see her in the background. I saw that drawing and I saw that picture of her way in the back. She was the largest boat built on the West Coast that year. 85 feet, the first boat with a television and a washer dryer on it. And this boat was just a feast for my eyes. And I embarked on a 9-month effort to find this boat. I was going to get a group of people together and bring it back to the Delta and restore it. With the help of the National Commodore, the Commodore of the National Historic Fleet, I found her. He called me and he said, she disappeared off the radar screen in 1992. And back up, Charles. She disappeared off the radar screen in 1992. And the last owner was Weldon Pool in Covington, Louisiana. So I just picked up the phone and called Covington, Louisiana Information. Weldon Pool. I got 2 numbers, left messages at both. And the next day, a very nice little southern lady, she was Weldon Pool's widow, called and said, call Rusty Burns, he knows all about the boat. And I found her on the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico. I called Rusty, and she had burned out on her shakeout cruise. They restored her, and you'll see in the pictures, they totally screwed her up. But at that time, everybody wanted, they wanted white boats, or they wanted this or that. But, to me, she had everything. And so I was very disappointed. Keep going. Henry Dolger had her built for $200,000. There were 500 people at Stevens Brothers in 1951 when she was splashed, and they had E.C. Robinson, the mayor of San Francisco, was in Stockton with Mr. Dolger, and he was known for Dolger Homes. Dolger Homes were 2 bedrooms, a bathroom above the garage, and he built communities like Westlake. And he built about 16,000 of these homes. They never gained the reputation of an Eichler, but they inspired the song Little Boxes on the Hillside by Malvina Reynolds. So anyway, this is Weldon Pool, and if you see the mechanism on the front of the boat that opens the windshield of the port house. See that mechanism? So I went down to Madison, Louisiana when the 49ers were in the Super Bowl against Baltimore. And I spent a half a day with Leon Fairburner. And he gave me that piece, and I have it here. You wanna hold it up? Sutton? That's the last remaining stretch of, that's the last remaining part of Westlake. That's all that's left. And we've talked about a Stevens Museum someday, and that will go in it. And that's Weldon Pool, who originally bought the boat. And like a lot of people, you know, what you find is somebody sees a Stevens and they'll follow it for years. I followed Folly for 10 years before we were able to put it together. He first saw, as I understand it, he first saw Westlake in the early 1950s and followed it and finally bought it in the 70s. It had been a charter boat and lots of other things. Keep going. Miss Budweiser was another boat. Oh, no, excuse me. This is Westlake. Looks like Miss Budweiser. So this is her restored, which I don't think is nearly as nice as the original boat. And on her shakeout cruise with 2,400 gallons of fuel on board, that's what happened to her. She's in 2,400 feet of water in the Gulf of Mexico. And that's Leon Fairburner, who I spent time with. He was the engineer on the boat that day. And they darn near drowned. They spent 4 hours in a lifeboat and barely got away. Anyway, George Amanko, who many of you know, owns a boat named Catherine. He told me, he said, you know, I know you're disappointed about Westlake, but he said there's a boat that looks very similar to it. It's a little smaller. So we photoshopped this, obviously. And that's Westlake at Stevens Yard up front. And this is Miss 102. Miss 102 is 60 feet. Westlake was 85. But you can see the similarities. And so I went down and began negotiating on Miss 102 and bought her a couple years later. And that was my first boat, first Stevens boat. This is Ahalani, the sister to Miss 102. This is interesting because Miss 102 was Ahalani before Ahalani was Ahalani. And let me tell you what happened. A man named Manuel Serpa, he did all the land leveling for the Turlock Irrigation District, a Portuguese dairy farmer, successful businessman. I actually knew his sons. We showed in 4-H and FFA and those things we do out in the Central Valley together, but I didn't know that they were involved with Stevens Boats. He ordered this boat, and to get more incestuous, he owned Folly at the time. So after Ken Bechtel, after 7 years, sold Folly, he sold her to Clessy Cummins, who took out the Holland Scott Invaders and put in his own N21 six-cylinder diesels. And he owned her for 7 years. Then he sold her to Manuel Serpa. Manuel Serpa owned her for 6 or 7 years. And then he ordered Ahalani. And there's a sideboard that goes back to the transom. And he wanted that to be one solid piece of wood. And there was a seam, and we call it the fatal seam. And it's still on Miss 102. And he rejected the boat for that reason. And when you brought that up to Dick Stevens, his temperature still went up 30 degrees. So they were going to have to do so much work to change that they said, look, this is such a beautiful boat, we'll send it to Southern California to be our showboat, and we'll make you a new one. So that's why Ahalani is a 1958 and Miss 102 is a 1956. This is Ahalani, but they're nearly identical. That's Miss 102 up front. I remember I thought it looked pretty good with a blue stripe, and I asked Dick Stevens one day, I said, you know, I think it looks pretty good with a blue stripe, and he said, blue is for Chris Craft, red is for Stevens. So anyway, that ended that. We were, back up a second, Charles. So that's Contessa on the left, a 1957 gas engine boat. And I was a little nervous about gas engines at that time. And my friend Bob Sloby, go to the next slide, on the left, he liked Contessa better. I liked Miss 102 better. We made a deal for Miss 102 in our offices in Sacramento. He went on eBay that night and put a bid in on Contessa and called me the next morning and said, "You won't believe what happened last night. I put a bid in and we own a second boat." I said, "We?" I said, "Our wives don't know about the first boat, much less about the second boat." And his wife's a federal judge who could have us both thrown in jail. So, anyway, and you know, we've used the boat for entertaining, and that's me next to Bob and my cousin and former captain of the Angel Island Ferry, and the guy in the green shirt, I can't remember, sweater, I can't remember his name, but anyway. And we've used the boats for entertaining and lots of political activities. That's Miss 102 and my Republican captain, Steve Mansard, who many of you know. All the water buffaloes in the Central Valley. And then this was America's Cup, where we spent a lot of time right here at St. Francis Yacht Club. And the second to the last day, I was calling people, couldn't get anybody to come with me. And then America won, and my phone just started smoking. We had 33 people the next day. At that time, it was the most people we'd ever had on the boat. Miss 102. I told you you'd get tired of seeing her. That's her in the Delta. And this picture actually led to us purchasing Folly. So we're coming up. John Perkins, the Perkins brothers, and I. We're coming up. We have a tradition for the stag cruise of going from here to Tinsley Island. And Ted Collins, my partner in Folly, was on another boat. And Ted is an avid photographer and has a wonderful Leica camera. And he took this shot and searched me out at the stag cruise and said, "I've got a money shot of your boat. You've got to see it." And I went and looked at it, and sure enough, I did, and that began a friendship that led to all of us getting together and investing in Folly. But I thought it was one of the best pictures ever taken of Miss 102. And that's Folly on the right side and Miss 102 on the left on my dock in Walnut Grove. It was about 1960 that things were changing in the boat business, and the Stevens were astute enough businessmen that they knew that the region and the Stockton area, which had always advantaged them as boat builders, was changing. And there was more regulation, higher costs, harder to find workers. And so they sold the company to Jack Rather, who built the Disneyland Hotel. He was in Ronald Reagan's kitchen cabinet. He had been trying to buy it from him to add it to his cachet of businesses, and they finally acquiesced and sold it to him. He owned it for 3 years, and he, I think when things were slow, he just ordered a boat. And there's about 4 Lone Rangers, and he's one of the people that owned multiple Stevens, like Ted Bricks and the Amelia Maries. But there are 4 Lone Rangers, and this is the largest one. It's now a charter boat on Hudson Bay, or the Hudson River, based in Manhattan.
What size is that one, Rusty?
73 feet. After 3 years, Rather Corporation decided it was not a fit for them, and the Stevens family quietly bought the company back. This is Joie, which was Ted Brick's third boat. My partner Ted Harris and I bought this boat in Southern California. I had been trying to see it for years. I went to the Hagen Museum, looked it up, and every time I made an appointment to go look at the boat, because I knew it was one of the great ones, the guy would cancel on me. And I didn't know if he was part of the governor's secret witness program or what it was, but he would always cancel. Sometimes I'd fly down there and I'd get a call at the airport when I landed. I don't have time today, you know. So then I get a call from the Hagen Museum. He had called the Hagen. Somebody had bought the marina he was in. He'd lived there 28 years. Never fired the engines up on this boat in 28 years. There was 900 gallons of fuel on it. And he had 2 weeks to get out. Somebody bought it and they didn't want any liverboards. So he was, I think it was a month to get out. So he was under tremendous pressure. I went down and looked at it. It was the only time I ever bought a boat without doing an out-of-the-water survey, don't. That was the lesson. But it looked fabulous. He was an antique dealer. We loved the boat. We loved the lines. Keep going, Ted. That's her right after we took possession. I tried to restore, working with people in Southern California. Lay days were $300 a day, and it was during the pandemic. You know, I couldn't manage it at all or oversee it. So I finally did something I didn't have any experience doing, and it actually turned out pretty well. This is one of those experiences in life that you wish you knew at the beginning, which you'll learn by the end. But we put the boat on a truck and brought it to Stockton. One of the engines had failed, and then the fun began. This is taking place in Stockton now. Lots of rot, lots of electrolysis. We replaced the propeller shafts, we replaced the propellers. Electrolysis had claimed one of the struts. There's a lot of the rot, termites, everything that could go wrong. I jokingly say the only thing we saved on this boat was the lines. That's the transom restored. She is going to really be something special when we're done. We got one break in the whole thing. And that was, and I still can't believe this happened. Some of you knew Gary Clausen at Twin Rivers, who passed just recently. But Brendan Schmidt, my surveyor, told me the boat's coming along, as you can see. We put a new deck on it. And go ahead, Charles. Yeah, that's her prior to restoration at Catalina. I convinced my wife that my daughter was going to school in Southern California, that this boat would be great while she was in school down there. And anyway, we got one trip before we put her on a truck and brought her up here. And it's been, you know, it's going to be fine when we're done, but I'll tell you, there were just a lot of surprises. Back up, Charles. So, you know, what we plan on doing is, this is 1960, and you can see that the boat's name is Amelia Marie. Ted Brick named it for his wife, who hated boating. And all of his boats were named Amelia Marie. And somewhere along the line, somebody named it Joie, and so far we've kept that name. But this was 1960 when they splashed the boat. And the Stockton Record did a big story. And we're going to go back to the Stevens Yard when Joie is done, and we're going to recreate this scene. And Donna and Pat and Chris have agreed to help us recreate it. You're all invited. You're all invited, and we're going to rechristen the boat and do a splash party just like they used to at Stevens. This is Mrs. Brick. When she couldn't find her husband, I think she broke the bottle of champagne on the front of the boat, which will probably happen to me. But anyway, it has been quite a journey. And you know, this presentation by design is not just about the history of Stevens Brothers. It's about my experience with Stevens. And I had the honor and pleasure of spending a lot of time with Dick Stevens. The Stevens family allowed him to spend time with me, and we became great friends at the time that my father had passed away, and he, in a way, became kind of a substitute for my late dad. And we spent a lot of time together, and he was our North Star. We didn't do anything without him. And he told me once, he said, I worked with two geniuses in my lifetime. One was Clessy Cummins, and the other one was Leo Fender. Leo Fender from Fender Guitar owns 6 Stevens boats. And I think Leo and Clessy knew that they were working with a genius also. Thank you very much.
Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful.
That's your mic.
Survey and like history of Stevens Marine. Good heavens. That's what hot. Oh, Steve? Yeah, there we go. Good. So each of us have dreams, and some of us, many people who own boats for a long time, dream about boats. Tell me about a Stevens dream. What would be in a Stevens dream if you were to have a dream about Stevens? Does the boat fast? Is the boat beautiful? Are people stopping and saying, who owns that?
If you're in a hurry, don't take a boat. These were the Learjets of their day. You know, if you go down the provenance of Stevens, I mean, out here there's a boat called Easy Way. Before it was called Easy Way, it was called Lady Smith. Before it was called Lady Smith, it was called Rosalind, a very well-known San Francisco family. The Swigs of Fairmont Hotel fame commissioned that boat. And in a well-traveled exercise, Dick Swig named the boat Rosalind for his wife, Sissy, who still lives in San Francisco and is in touch with Jonathan Perkins, one of our partners in Folly, who owns the boat today. So, you know, to me, you know, owning a Stevens boat in the 30s, 40s, 50s, you know, you had arrived, basically. You go back, you look at the provenance and the registry of Stevens boats, you know, they're families whose streets are named after. They're the people who developed the commerce and businesses in San Francisco. They're the philanthropists. You know, Folly, you know, Dick Stevens always told me that Folly was the best boat that they ever built. I think he has told some other people something similar about that boat. But Dick didn't design that boat. Dick's father, Roy, designed that boat. And when they christened that boat, it was the toughest crowd they'd ever had at Stevens Brothers. They had to bring in security that day. Remember, Johnny Joseph Marino ordered it under the AKA Robert K. Toohey. And Dick Stevens was 11 years old, and his toy boat was stolen from the boatyard that day. And he was still pissed off about it at 100. He told me that story. So, you know, I mean, there's just a romance. There's a history with all these things. You go back and look at the incredible people that owned them and their stories. And to me, that's what's so enjoyable. And look, it was Trumpy on the East Coast and it was Stevens on the West Coast. And arguably, Trumpy may have been a better built boat, but they didn't have the panache, the lines, the charisma that a Stevens does on the water. When you see a Stevens on the water, it pops. It's like a Reba.
So as a little boy in this club in the 60s, Dolger used to keep Westlake right out here in front. She was one of the boats that bowed into the dock in a diagonal berth. And it was a party machine. It was one long party all through the weekend. And as a young, 13, 14, 15-year-old kid running around the docks, we were always honored when we could be asked on the boat. And he wasn't a sailor. He couldn't sail. He could never sail his way out of a harbor, but he could basically sell houses like nobody's business. Westlake, the entire Westlake was built by Dolger, and that's a long heritage that this club has. The Sunset District was built by a guy named Artie Russo, and he was the yachtsman at St. Francis Yacht Club. And big pieces of Castro Valley and Hayward were built by Denny Jordan, who was the only three-term commodore of this yacht club. So there's a long association between entrepreneurs in the Bay Area and yachting, and many of them had Stevens yachts. They were the prestige ride for a person to have. So, and the Stevens, there's a museum. If you go up to the Hagen Museum, Rusty, how much time have you spent in the museum?
A lot of time. I mean, that's our resources. We go there, you make an appointment, and they come out there with the white gloves, they pull a file, and it's fascinating, to go back in every little dispute. There's communication between the owner and, payments and design features and all kinds of things. There were letters written by the new owner of Westlake as he was going through the Panama Canal, and she spent a lot of time in the Caribbean. I want to thank George Olson, because George is one of the people that like you, Ron, he knew a lot of these people, and I spent a lot of time with George picking his brain, because I read about him, I research him, but I didn't know him. George and Ron knew a lot of these people. Some of the rest of you in this room knew or became acquainted with or interacted with with some of these people. And they were characters, like a lot of really successful people. You know, they were characters, and this is how they choose to spend their time. And they respected the artistry of Stevens.
So if anyone has a question, raise a hand, we'll give you the mic and entertain your question. So there's been a lot of work lately in the Delta, woodworking. Rusty, talk a little bit about this growing trend. It's not expensive, but it's quite good quality. We saw Joa up there. What about the budding little business of woodworking and boat working in the Delta, the California Delta?
Yeah, there seems to be a bit of a renaissance, although like in all industries, it's really hard to find people. It's gotten expensive. Actually, a lot of the Hispanic workers that learned at Stevens Brothers and a lot of the other haul-out spots, boat yards, are the ones that have taken up the craft. Jose Montano has worked on all three of my boats, and you know I couldn't do it without him. I don't think there's nearly the vitality that there is in Port Townsend and places like that up in Washington.
Right.
But hopefully it'll enjoy some kind of a renaissance.
Now, we showed a picture, you had an illustration, a photo of your boat being taken across land, 56-foot boat. Tell people what the game was like when you're going to move a 56-foot, quote, wide load across land. What's that all about? The permits and so on.
You know, I used a company called Associated, and other than the amount of time it took me to get them to pick the boat up and deliver it, they were fascinating. I mean, they would call me and they'd say, well, you know, so it's 334 miles from where the boat was in Southern California, middle of the pandemic. You know, I was afraid to get on an airplane to go down there, and damn if I was going to drive, to check on things. Lay days down there are 5-6 times what they are up here. So they call me and they say, well, 1,700 miles. We had to go, I don't know, somewhere halfway to Connecticut. Because there's all these overpasses that they can't get under. And I worked with them, and I'd been on the transportation committee and still had contacts at Caltrans when I was in the legislature. And so I called on those contacts. Finally, we got down to about 434 miles from the original estimate of 1,700. They spent 6 miles on I-5. And if you go back to that picture, it's a goat trail on a mountain. And I'll tell you, if any of you are ever thinking about getting into some illicit business, find one of those truck drivers or their pilot guys, because they know back roads and ways. So you know, it was a fascinating kind of an experience, and it worked out really, really well for us. And you know, it's 25-30 miles from my home, so I'm able to go there regularly, and I had my people working on it. I mean, I can't even imagine what it would have happened and what it would have cost if I had kept trying to do it as an absentee owner. And I will tell you, the best way to buy these boats is find someone who loved it like I do, who takes good care of them, and then buy it from the family when he checks out. That's the best way to buy one of these boats. Now, you're going to have to deal with his wife, who he's blown a lot of smoke up her skirt about what that boat was worth. That may take years, but eventually you'll get it. Eventually you'll get it. That was the experience with Folly. And I think we went from 700,000 to less than 2 over a long period of time. But we finally got the boat. My rule for owners is that nobody's trying to figure out who put the last gallon of diesel in the boat, and if you're with them on the boat, that you enjoy each other. And so far, I've been successful in all my partnerships. Ted Harris is my partner in this boat, and he's my business partner. He has been stellar. He never signed up for what we've had to deal with to get this boat done. But a funny story I was going to tell. So I mentioned Gary Clausen, now the late Gary Clausen, but one of the motors on the boat failed. And, you know, I thought maybe the captain had run it without oil. I didn't know what. There were all kinds of scenarios. But when they broke the boat down, they found a defective valve. And so I called Brendan Schmidt, my surveyor, and he said, you may have an insurance claim. I said, how the hell can I have an insurance claim on an engine that's 60 years old? Or a warranty claim. So we put in the claim. Gary Clausen from Twin Rivers helped me do that. We got a rejection. And we filed an appeal. And the company brought in metallurgists and all kinds of other people to look at it. We had a meeting down there, and Gary said, go call Orvis Stacy. He is the guru of Detroit diesels on the West Coast. Some of you may know Orvis, but Orvis had 3 shops, and he loved Detroit diesels. He knew more about them than anybody. He was 92 years old. I drove up to Copperopolis, picked him up, brought him down. He takes one look at it, and he says, it's a latent defect. This is a factory defect on a 62-year-old valve. And the suits from the insurance company, the metallurgists were all there. They all knew of Stacy's reputation. They all said, yeah, Stacy's right. I know. So we ended up with a $71,000 claim, which went a long way toward helping out. And we rebuilt the engine. I mean, I still can't believe that. Orvis died 2 weeks later. And then Gary Clausen tragically passed away also, and I am in Orvis's debt and Gary's forever. But that was the one break we got on the restoration of this boat. I plan to bring it here when we're done. Of course, you're all going to be at the christening, but I plan to bring it here 30 or so hours shakeout in order to take it to Southern California on its own bottom. And it'll be somewhere in Southern California. We're going to use it to take our families to and friends to Catalina. That's kind of the idea.
So Rusty Arias, start with brilliant brothers in the Delta, add a lot of speed, incredible technology, wonderful craftsmanship, and 80 years of love. Thank you for bringing us the story of Stevens Marine. Thank you. Can you indulge me for just a minute? I've gotten great joy. We've all heard that little saying, painful saying at times, like there's 2 happy days in a boat owner's life. You've all heard that. Well, I disagree with it. I have had great joy in dealing with these boats. There have been some painful days, and you saw pictures of some of them. But I want to acknowledge the Stevens family and thank them. Bravo. 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 You and your family and your essential workers have brought to so many of us in this room. Thank you. Thank you all. Wonderful. And with that, we adjourn the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon. Thank you, everyone. Hey.